So I'm looking at one argument only of the four, three, four, as you wish, presented by Plato. The cyclical argument is one that Plato offers for the immortality of the soul. I've broken it down into a few basic premises and then the conclusion. And then we can do essentially what Kimberly did and just run through it and see how this works. So the first premise Plato gives, all things come from their opposites. I've added the quote there from the Phaedo, but you can read that a bit later, or if we want to interrogate each of the premises, we can look at that specific quote. But what it comes down to is all things come from their opposites. Then, between opposite states are opposite processes. We can say that there is a opposite state of being hot and being cold. And this is simply a state. That's an attribute of me. Processes that are also opposing is heating up and cooling down. So if hot comes from cold, then at some point cold has to heat up to get hot. And so we have states being hot, being cold, and processes becoming hot or heating up, as well as cooling down, and these oppose. Thirdly, if opposite processes do not balance out, everything would ultimately be in the same state. So we can take here again the heating up or the cooling down. If enough things don't heat up as enough other things cool down at the same time, then everything may just end up heating up and we'll end up with just hot things. And everything will be the same. It'll just be hot. The state will be the same, like premise 2, opposite states. It'll just be hot. The opposite processes heating up, and then we're just left with hot stuff heating up. And he says that would make everything the same. Of course, I've chosen hot. You can choose cold. Everything could cool down and everything could ultimately be cool. But he says that that's the case if they don't balance out. Fourthly, being alive is opposed to the state of being dead. And so coming to life and dying are the processes that correspond to these two oppositions. And coming to life must balance out dying. Therefore, he says, everything that dies must come back again. So this is his argument for why the soul is immortal. Here we go. Hot things were cold, he says. Everything comes from its opposite. Whatever is hot at the moment used to be cold. And whatever is cold at the moment used to be hot. There we have the opposite states. Hot things, in order to get cold, had to cool down. And cold things warm up. There's the processes. And so in the same way, we can look at life and death. Alive things were dead, because everything comes from its opposite. Cold comes from hot, hot from cold, alive from dead, dead from alive. So alive things were dead, dead things were alive. There we have the opposite states. And then the processes, well, alive things die, the verb, to die, the process, and dead things come alive. And so if you take that as the same as hot and cold, structure is the same, the basic argument works in the same logic. If it should be the case that the dead come back to life, then the dead must exist some way, right? Because if I die, and then later something comes back, where is the soul in between these processes? And so he makes reference to the ancient story of Hades, the underworld. You live in this world. Obviously, you go through change. You die. You're in Hades. From Hades, you come back to life. You live. And so there's this continuous cold getting hot, hot getting cold, life getting death, death getting life. And then the question is, when you're not in this life and you're in Hades, the soul is somewhere. And therefore, there is a life after death, and the soul is immortal. This is his argument. It's slightly more difficult to buy into it today, I think, than it would have been in antiquity, because it's an odd kind of approach to try to prove the immortality of the soul. It would have made a lot more sense culturally in his time. Nonetheless, what can we do with this? Well, the first is the argument tends to rest on this idea of opposites. We have opposite processes, we have opposite states. Opposites come out of one another. So opposites is doing a lot of work in this argument. What do we know about opposites? There's just and unjust, good, evil, twice, being alive, being dead. Those are opposites, fine. Contraries. These are mutually exclusive in that sense, and it's kind of saying you have good and you have non-good, and you divide the world into two. There's food and there's non-food. Anything I can eat is food, anything I can't eat, non-food. And you just say that they're opposites, edible, inedible. There are no degrees here, right? Dead and alive, you can't be deader than before or aliver than before. It's yes or no. Food is edible or it's not. Then we have the other opposites like greater and lesser, or larger and smaller, or colder and hotter. And these are the examples that Plato also uses. I've only used his examples here. And these are called comparatives because we compare. I am currently colder than I was earlier. Therefore, I have cooled down, right? So here we see the becoming, the process, and the way to compare different states. These are not absolutes, but these are comparatives. There are degrees. And so there seems to be two different ideas of opposite going on. Plato seems to use these two senses of opposite, pretending that they mean the same thing. And he doesn't make explicit that he's changing the meaning, or that he depends upon a different meaning. If you think back to the logical fallacies objectives you may or may not have done in the past, this is a classic case of equivocation. And so a different way to show the equivocation is to say, today I went to the bank, meaning financial institute, and I got some money. I also went for a swim at the bank, meaning the riverbank. Therefore, I conclude you need a swimsuit to get your money. And it makes sense if you just treat the word bank as being the same thing every time you see the same word. But it's not. It doesn't mean the same thing. And opposites are the same. So that's an internal logical problem of this argument. I have two quick objections, and then I get to a slightly more meaty one. And this is with premise 3. If opposite processes do not balance out, everything would ultimately be in the same state. If we go back a few, all things come from their opposites. Between opposite states are opposite processes. Opposite processes do not balance out, then everything would ultimately be in the same state. Therefore, coming to life and dying must balance, because everything is not in the same state, and therefore souls are immortal. And so this is the premise that I take a bit of exception with. If opposite processes do not balance out, everything would ultimately be in the same state. So what? Okay, right? Maybe over time, life is reducing to death. And over time, there will just be death or dead stuff, right? This is possible. He hasn't made the argument that the universe is a place where everything is always in balance or must be in balance. It could be that we're slowly just moving to the death of the universe, which, right? If that's the case, that's the case. But he uses that as a point of argument, and he seems to just not want it. And so that's a very weak spot in his argument. Or if we say that he's correct, then if the argument holds, is there an introduction of new souls, right? Because if they die and they come back and they die and they come back and they die and they come back, do new souls get created? Or is it just this constant recycling, the balancing, the hot gets cold, the cold gets hot, the hot gets cold, the water could be steam and then frozen and then steam and then frozen. Is there ever more water being added to the system? And so if he's right, then it seems a closed loop. And if he's wrong, then his premise 3 just fails completely. So I've kind of put him in a position where yes or no regarding premise 3, neither work. So the argument denies one possible implication, and the argument has its own unwanted implications, which is a precarious spot for an argument to find itself. And so a slightly more serious objection here. So what is it that dies in this death-life cycle? Because you have life, its opposite, death. And remember, we're working towards immortality, which is no death, right? So after death, the soul lives on. This is his conclusion. So obviously, it's not the soul that dies. Thus, the body dies. Do living bodies come back from dead ones? Does this fit his logic? Where the soul dies, goes into death, from death, born into life, life, born into death, heat, hot, cold, larger, smaller, all the stuff. Does the body work in the same way, like a soul? Even if they did, this would not say anything about the immortality of the soul. This is a separate argument entirely. If a being is a material being, and an only material being, for example, its life can come from the death of something else. And here at the bottom, I just have animal, die, decompose, nutrients, life, in a tree or a worm or something else. Why must it be the same thing, the soul, that continuously finds itself in this closed loop? And if he's just argued that the soul is immortal, how is it that everything comes from its opposite if the soul never dies? If the soul is pure life, only life, but life comes from death, which is the very thing that he asserts in his first and second premise, then where's the room for the soul? So the conclusion seems to tell us that the premises are false. If the soul is immortal, and the soul never dies, and premise 1, all things come from their opposites, is true, then what did the soul come from? What is the opposite of immortal, right? Permanent death, no life whatsoever. But how does no life whatsoever result in life? Because then it's not no life whatsoever. And so in this case, I've been very unfair to Plato, I would like to add, because he offers 4 arguments and he says they work together and they supplement one another. And I've just picked one out of it and gotten a little critical with it without paying attention to the other things he has to say. So this is not some groundbreaking critique of Plato. It just shows this argument on its own doesn't stand. And I think he makes some unfortunate errors in that.